How do you erase 12,000 men from a photograph? On May 10th, 1869, at Promontory Summit in the Utah Territory, the Central Pacific Railroad and the Union Pacific Railroad met, and a golden spike was driven into the final tie connecting the eastern and western halves of the first Transcontinental Railroad in the United States. A photograph was taken. The photograph is one of the most famous images in American history. Two locomotives face each other, their pilots nearly touching. Workers and officials and railroad executives and dignitaries crowd the frame, standing on the locomotives, on the tenders, on the rail cars, on the ground between the tracks. Bottles are raised, hands are clasped. The moment is the culmination of 6 years of construction, 1,776 miles of track, and the physical connection of the Atlantic coast to the Pacific coast by continuous rail for the first time in history. Everybody is in the photograph. The executives of both companies, the engineers, the surveyors, the laborers, the politicians, the journalists. Everybody is in the photograph except the men who built the western half of the railroad. The Chinese workers who constituted 80 to 90% of the Central Pacific Railroad's labor force, the 10,000 to 15,000 men from Guangdong province in southern China who drilled 15 tunnels through the granite of the Sierra Nevada, who hung from ropes off the face of cliffs 1,300 feet above the American River to set explosive charges by hand, who survived 2 of the worst winters on record in the Sierra in 40-foot snowdrifts and avalanches that buried entire camps, who laid 690 miles of track across mountains and desert from Sacramento, California to Promontory Summit, Utah, are not in the photograph. Not one Chinese face appears in the most famous image of the achievement that their labor made possible. 8. Chinese workers moved the final rail into place before the golden spike was driven. They positioned the rail. They were there. They are not in the picture. The photograph was composed to exclude them. The ceremony was organized to exclude them. The history was written to exclude them. And the payroll records of the Central Pacific Railroad, the documents that record who worked on the railroad and what they were paid, list the Chinese workers not by name but by gang number, groups of 30 men identified collectively, their individual identities submerged in a number on a ledger, their wages dumped into one of the Chinese men's hats by an interpreter named Sam Thayer, who spoke what he claimed were half a dozen Chinese dialects, and who moved from gang to gang with the money already counted out and no time for explanations. The men had to take it whether they liked it or not. That is from the Vallejo Evening Chronicle of January 11th, 1869. The workers took what was put in the hat. Their names were not written down. Every white worker who died during the construction of the Central Pacific Railroad is identified by name in the company's records. The Chinese workers who died are counted in aggregate when they are counted at all. An estimated 1,200 of them are dead. Their names are not in the records. Their bones are along the railroad grade between Sacramento and Promontory Summit in unmarked graves in the desert of Nevada and the mountains of Utah and the granite of the Sierra Nevada. Some of them shipped back to China by the Chinese 6 companies. Some of them never shipped at all. Still in the ground where they were buried by their fellow workers along the tracks they built. I went looking for the records. What I found was the most complete erasure of a labor force in American industrial history, documented not by what the records contain, but by what they do not contain. The names are missing, the photographs are composed to exclude, the ceremony was staged to erase, the history was written to forget. The machines that built the Transcontinental Railroad, the hand drills and the black powder and the nitroglycerin and the one-lung donkey engines and the dump carts and the picks and the shovels and the ropes that lowered men down cliff faces, those machines were operated by 12,000 men whose individual identities the company that employed them did not consider worth recording. The Central Pacific Railroad broke ground in Sacramento, California on January 8, 1863. The company was led by 4 Sacramento merchants who became known as the Big Four: Leland Stanford, who served as president and later became governor of California and the founder of Stanford University; Collis P. Huntington, who managed the company's finances and lobbied Congress in Washington, Mark Hopkins, the company treasurer, and Charles Crocker, who oversaw construction. The construction superintendent was James Harvey Strobridge, a hard-driving foreman who had lost his left eye to a premature black powder explosion while blasting through a rock ridge at Bloomer Ranch in the spring of 1864, and who continued to direct the work with his remaining eye for the next 5 years. The Chinese workers who learned English called Strobridge the one-eyed bossy man and respected him, and by most accounts he respected them in return, though the respect did not extend to equal pay or equal treatment or the recording of their names. By mid-1864, the Central Pacific had laid only 50 miles of track. The terrain east of Sacramento rose steadily toward the summit of the Sierra Nevada, and the work of grading, blasting, and laying track through increasingly difficult mountain terrain was exhausting the available labor force. White workers, mostly Irish immigrants and Civil War veterans, quit the job steadily, many of them leaving to prospect for silver in the Nevada mines. At any given time, only 1 in 10 hired white laborers stayed on the job longer than a week. The Central Pacific's workforce had shrunk to approximately 800 men, and the company estimated it needed 5,000 to make progress. Charles Crocker proposed hiring Chinese laborers. Strobridge objected. He did not believe the Chinese, who averaged roughly 120 pounds per man, had the physical capacity for the work. Crocker overruled him. 50 Chinese workers were hired as a trial crew. Within weeks, the trial crew had demonstrated that the Chinese not only could do the work, but did it with a discipline, an endurance, and an organizational efficiency that the white crews could not match. Crocker began recruiting Chinese workers aggressively. He hired every available Chinese laborer in California and then began paying to import workers directly from the villages of Guangdong Province in southern China. By 1867, the Central Pacific's workforce was 80 to 90% Chinese, with 10,000 to 15,000 men working at any given time. The Chinese workers were the largest assembled Chinese labor force in the history of the Western Hemisphere. The Chinese workers were paid $26 to $31 per month at the start, later raised to $35 per month. The white workers were paid $35 to $40 per month, plus free food and free housing. The Chinese workers received no food and no housing. They purchased their own food, arranged their own cooking through designated camp cooks, provided their own lodging in tents and wooden huts they built themselves along the railroad grade, and supplied their own hand tools. After subtracting the cost of food and supplies from their wages, the Chinese workers took home approximately half what the white workers earned for the same labor. The Chinese worked 11-hour days, 6 days a week. The white workers worked 10-hour days with the same weekly schedule. The pay disparity and the working conditions disparity were not incidental. They were the economic foundation of the Central Pacific's business model. The Chinese workers were hired because they were cheaper. They were kept because they were better. They were not named because they were Chinese. If the Stanford Chinese Railroad Workers in North America project interests you, it is the most comprehensive academic effort to recover the history of these workers. Gordon Chang's book, Ghosts of Gold Mountain, is the definitive narrative account. The records are being assembled. Subscribe if you want to see where the next thread leads. The most dangerous section of the Central Pacific's route was the 15-tunnel passage through the Sierra Nevada between Cisco, California, and the Nevada state line. The tunnels were drilled and blasted through solid granite using hand drills, black powder, and for the hardest section, nitroglycerin. Summit Tunnel, designated Tunnel Number 6, was 1,659 feet long, bored through the granite of Donner Summit at an elevation of approximately 7,000 feet above sea level. The tunnel took 16 months to complete. Chinese workers drilled blast holes into the granite face by hand, using star drills struck with hammers. One man holding the drill and another striking it, rotating the drill a quarter turn between blows, deepening the hole 1 chip of granite at a time. When the hole was deep enough, black powder was packed into it, a fuse was inserted, the powder was tamped, the fuse was lit, and the workers retreated around a corner or behind a blast shield and waited for the detonation. 500 kegs of black powder were consumed per day across the tunnel operations in the Sierra. The progress was measured in inches per day. The granite was among the hardest rock on the continent. To speed the work on Summit Tunnel, the company's engineers ordered a vertical shaft drilled from the top of the mountain straight down 72 feet to the midpoint of the planned tunnel. Chinese workers drilled the shaft by hand, removed the rock in buckets hoisted by a donkey engine on the surface, and when the shaft reached the tunnel level, work began simultaneously in 4 directions: east and west from both ends of the tunnel, and east and west from the bottom of the central shaft. The 4 headings advanced toward each other at a combined rate that was still measured in feet per week. A chemist on the construction site mixed nitroglycerin, a liquid explosive roughly 8 times more powerful than black powder, and the nitroglycerin was used in the Summit Tunnel to blast through the hardest sections of granite. Nitroglycerin is extraordinarily unstable. It detonates from shock, from heat, from friction, from being dropped. The men who carried the nitroglycerin from the mixing point to the tunnel face and packed it into the drill holes were carrying a liquid explosive that could detonate in their hands if they stumbled on the granite rubble of the tunnel floor. The company used nitroglycerin only briefly at Summit Tunnel and then abandoned it because the casualties from premature detonations were too high even by the standards of an operation that was already killing workers regularly with black powder. Before the tunnels, there was Cape Horn. In the summer of 1865, the railroad line had to be carved around a rocky promontory 1,300 feet above the North Fork of the American River on a sheer cliff face that no conventional construction method could reach. Most engineers considered the task impossible. The Chinese workers devised a method. They wove reed baskets large enough to hold a man, suspended the baskets from ropes anchored at the top of the cliff, and lowered themselves over the edge. The men in the baskets hung against the cliff face 1,300 feet above the river, drilled holes in the rock by hand, packed the holes with black powder, lit the fuses, and signaled to the men above to haul them up before the charges detonated. The men above hauled on the ropes. The charges exploded. The rock fell away. The men were lowered again to drill the next set of holes. The process was repeated across the face of the cliff until a ledge wide enough for a railroad bed had been cut into the rock. The workers who were not hauled up in time before the detonation were killed by the blast, or by the falling rock, or by the fall itself, 1,300 feet to the river below. The number who died at Cape Horn is not recorded in the company's records. The winters of 1865 to 1866 and 1866 to 1867 were among the harshest on record in the Sierra Nevada. Snowdrifts reached 40 feet in depth at the Summit construction camps. Approximately 3,000 Chinese workers lived in tents and wooden huts along the railroad grade at elevations above 6,000 feet, in conditions that men from the subtropical climate of Guangdong province had never experienced and could not have anticipated. Avalanches swept through the construction camps without warning. An avalanche could bury an entire camp, tents and workers and tools and supplies, under tons of snow and debris in seconds. The bodies of workers killed by avalanches were not recovered until the spring thaw months later, when the snow melted and revealed the dead where they had fallen or where the slide had carried them. Some bodies were found still holding their tools. Some were found in the positions they had been sleeping in when the avalanche struck their tents in the night. The company did not record their names. The company recorded the count. In June of 1867, the Chinese workers did something that the Central Pacific Railroad had not anticipated. They struck. Approximately 3,000 Chinese workers in the Sierra Nevada put down their tools, returned to their camps, and refused to work. The strike was organized through the headmen of the work gangs, the Chinese foremen who managed the groups of 30 and who communicated the workers' demands to the company through interpreters. The demands were specific. The Chinese workers wanted pay equal to the white workers, $40 per month. They wanted a 10-hour workday instead of the 11 hours they were working. They wanted improved working conditions in the tunnels, including better ventilation. They wanted the right to leave the employment of the railroad without being forcibly returned. The strike of June 1867 was, at the time, the largest labor action in the history of the United States. Charles Crocker responded by cutting off the food supply trains. The Chinese workers, camped at elevations above 6,000 feet in the Sierra Nevada, miles from any settlement, entirely dependent on the railroad's supply chain for food and water, had no alternative source of provisions. They could not forage. They could not hunt. They could not buy food from a store because there were no stores. The nearest town was days away on foot. Crocker reportedly threatened violence against any worker who attempted to leave the camps. After 8 days without food, the Chinese workers returned to work. None of their demands were met. There is evidence in the historical record that a small pay increase was granted several months later, but the increase was not announced as a concession to the strike and was not accompanied by any change in working hours or conditions. The railroad was completed on May 10, 1869. The Central Pacific had laid 690 miles of track from Sacramento across the Sierra Nevada, across the deserts of Nevada, and into the Utah Territory. The Union Pacific had laid 1,086 miles from Council Bluffs, Iowa, across the Great Plains and through the Rockies. The Golden Spike ceremony at Promontory Summit was a national celebration. The Chinese workers were not invited. They were not included in the official proceedings. They were not in the photograph. 8 of them positioned the final rail. Then they stepped out of the frame. Within months of the railroad's completion, the 12,000 Chinese workers who had built the western half were suddenly unemployed. They dispersed across the West, finding work in lumber mills, laundries, restaurants, farms, and mines. The communities that had depended on their labor did not welcome them. Anti-Chinese sentiment, which had been present throughout the construction period but had been suppressed by the railroad company's need for cheap labor, erupted across the western states. Mobs attacked Chinese settlements in Los Angeles, in Denver, and Rock Springs, Wyoming, where 28 Chinese miners were murdered by white miners in 1885. In 1882, the United States Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, which prohibited Chinese laborers from entering the country and barred Chinese immigrants from becoming naturalized citizens. The Chinese Exclusion Act was the first federal law to ban immigration based on race and nationality. It remained in effect until 1943. The men who built the Transcontinental Railroad were banned from the country, whose most celebrated infrastructure project their labor had made possible. The bones of the Chinese workers who died during construction were collected, where possible, by representatives of the Chinese Six Companies, a mutual aid organization based in San Francisco that served the Chinese immigrant community. Chinese burial tradition required that the remains of the deceased be returned to their home province for interment in family burial grounds. In January 1870, 8 months after the Golden Spike ceremony, 6 railroad cars, loaded with the remains of Chinese workers, departed the rail line for transport to San Francisco and eventual shipment across the Pacific to Guangdong province. The bones of more than 1,000 workers were reportedly shipped back to China. Many were not. Recent archaeological research by Michael Polk and others has identified more than 40 to 50 Chinese grave sites along the railroad grade in western Utah alone, near the section stations at Terrace, Matlin, and Roselle. Graves that were never exhumed, bones that were never collected, remains that were never returned to China. The graves are unmarked. They are located along the original railroad grade, on federal land, in the desert, in the same positions where the workers were buried by their fellow laborers when they died during construction. Some of the graves have been confirmed by cadaver detection dogs, trained to locate historic human remains. The graves are still there. The workers are still in the ground, along the tracks they laid. In a country that banned their countrymen from entering 13 years after they built the railroad that connected it. I started with a question about erasure. How do you erase 12,000 men from a photograph? You compose the frame to exclude them. You organize the ceremony to exclude them. You list them by gang number instead of by name on the payroll. You pay them by dumping money into a hat and moving on to the next gang. You do not provide them food or housing, and then you use the food supply as a weapon when they strike for equal pay. You record their deaths as a number, not as names. You do not invite them to the ceremony that celebrates the completion of the work they did. You do not include them in the photograph that documents the moment. You pass a law 13 years later banning their countrymen from entering the country. You wait 100 years to build a memorial. You wait 150 years to fund an academic project to recover their names. The Chinese workers drilled Summit Tunnel through 1,659 feet of solid granite in 16 months with hand drills and black powder and nitroglycerin. They hung in reed baskets off the face of a cliff 1,300 feet above the American River and drilled blast holes by hand and lit fuses and prayed to be hauled up in time. They survived 40-foot snowdrifts and avalanches that buried their camps and killed their friends, whose bodies were not found until spring. They laid 10 miles of track in 12 hours on a single record-setting day near the end of the construction. They built 37 miles of snow sheds through the Sierra to protect the tracks they had laid from the avalanches they had survived. They did all of this for $26 to $35 a month, minus food, minus housing, minus tools, at 11 hours a day, 6 days a week, for 6 years. 12,000 men from Guangdong province, approximately 1,200 dead, 0 names in the company's records. The Stanford Chinese Railroad Workers in North America. Project at Stanford University has spent more than a decade attempting to recover the individual identities of the workers from Chinese language sources, from Guangdong province genealogical records, from family documents, from oral histories passed down through generations of Chinese American families. The project has recovered some names, not enough. The gap in the record is not an accident. The gap is the record. The Central Pacific Railroad chose not to write down the names of the men who built its railroad. That choice is the most precise documentation of how the company viewed the 12,000 men who did the work as a number, not as names, listed by gang, paid by hat, and excluded from the photograph. The Summit Tunnel is still there. You can walk through it. It is part of the Donner Summit Historical Society's trail system near Truckee, California. The granite walls that the Chinese workers drilled and blasted by hand 160 years ago are still standing. The chisel marks from the hand drills are still visible in the rock. The tunnel is dark. It is cold. It smells like wet granite. The men who carved it are not named on any plaque at either end. There are more of these stories. More machines. More furnaces. More men who went into the dark and came out different, or didn't come out at all. Subscribe if you want to see what I pull from the records next. If you want to see how a jammed asbestos curtain turned a Chicago theater into a death trap and killed 602 people in 15 minutes, that video is on screen now.